Hey guys, welcome back. In today's video, we're going to be talking about scouting your property for the first time following the hunting season. And while there are a lot of great times to scout your property throughout the year, my absolute favorite time to scout my property is immediately following the previous hunting season. And there are a few reasons that I like this time of year for scouting. First, a lot of the deer sign that you're going to find on your property is going to directly relate to the previous hunting season. Now, this isn't the case with all the sign. It's going to kind of vary a little bit year by year depending on weather. For example, if you've had below average temperatures in your area, you've gotten dumped on with snow, you're basically having a really harsh winter, maybe sooner than what you normally do. These deer might have shifted into their winter patterns, and so a lot of the sign might be more related to late season hunting. So depending on your area or the weather on any given year, that fresh sign that you're finding on your property on that first scout might not always relate directly to the previous hunting season during the fall, but it might relate more to that December timeframe, that late season hunting. But I would say on average, most years, that sign that you're going to be finding while scouting your property for the first time following the hunting season is going to directly relate to the previous hunting season. At least that's the case here in Southwest Michigan. Our winters don't really start getting that harsh until mid to late January. The other reason I really like scouting my property immediately following the hunting season is because there is absolutely zero risk that I'm going to be bumping off one of my bucks off to the neighbors to potentially get shot. Now, I don't think I have a whole lot of neighbors that are hunting past December 15, into late December, but you never really know who's in the woods. Every once in a while you hear a couple gunshots. So for me, it's not worth the risk. I'm not going to be pushing into my property to scout it during the hunting season. I can wait a few weeks. Again, I don't want to risk pushing one of the deer, one of the bucks that I've been trying to protect and pass on all season to my neighbors and accidentally have them get shot. Let's face it, not everybody has the same hunting goals, and that's okay. You just don't want to bump one of your bucks off your property and take that chance. Wait the few extra weeks until the hunting season is over to scout your property. Moving on to actually scouting your property, we're going to be talking about a few things that I'm looking for while I'm doing my postseason scout. And while some of these might seem fairly obvious, a lot of what we're doing is common sense. It kind of just boils down to actually doing the work, doing the scouting, because a lot of the observations that you're going to make on your property are going to make you a better hunter and a better land manager. And these are going to be in no particular order, but the first thing that I want to talk about are scouting the food sources on your property. And with scouting the food sources, there are a few things that we want to take note of. The first is, did your food sources last the entire season? So if you have food plots on your property, and this is going to vary on every single property because every property is going to have a different deer density and a different percentage of their property will be put into food plots. But with the food plots that you did put on your property, did they last the entire season? Do you still have food in your food plots after the season, or were they eaten down to the dirt? Depending on what you're seeing with the amount of food left in your food plots, you might come to a couple different conclusions. Again, every property is going to be a little bit different. But for example, let's say you have a lot of food on your property. There's not really much room to expand the food plots. You put a lot of food out there and it's still getting hammered. It's still getting eaten down to the dirt and you're not really carrying much over past the hunting season. Well, this might tell me that you have too many deer in your area and you need to work on your doe harvest the following season. You might need to bring your deer numbers down because they're consuming everything before the season ends. Another similar scenario might be that your food plots aren't making it the entire season, but you don't offer a whole lot of food on your property. This might be an example where you need to expand your food plot system or your food plot acreage on your property. Now, you might also have too many deer for the area. It might be a combination of both, but that's a scenario where maybe you should be thinking about expanding your food plots to offer more food on your property. Another thing that I'm trying to take note of while scouting my food plots is, what were the preferred species this past season? What are the deer choosing to browse on, and maybe what are they leaving alone? While having a lot of diversity within your food plots is a top priority, if you're noticing that the deer aren't touching this or they're not browsing on that, then maybe it's time to reevaluate your seed blend. If they haven't touched a certain crop or a certain species for a few seasons, it might be time to just move on from that and plant something else within the food plot blend. Moving away from food plots, but sticking with the category of food, another thing that I'm looking at during my postseason scout is the woody browse pressure on my property. You can look at the woody browse pressure on your property through a similar lens that you do with the amount of food that you're carrying over into the off season within your food plots. If you're noticing that on a lot of those younger trees, maybe chest height and lower, that early successional growth is being browsed heavily, maybe a majority of those younger trees, those buds are being nipped off, or maybe all of those young trees, the buds are being nipped off. Again, you can come to a very similar conclusion that we did with the food plots if you're not carrying food into the off season. And that's either one is that you might have too many deer for that area and you don't have enough food to support that many whitetails. The other end of it, and this is very common on a lot of properties, is that you just don't have enough woody browse on your property. So you might not have a lot of deer, you just don't have a lot of woody browse, so that the woody browse that is out there is heavily browsed on. I don't know if you can see behind me, but this is basically a closed canopy hardwoods. There's nothing growing on the forest floor. There's not a lot of woody browse. There's a little bit behind the camera. But if I went through and I looked at those trees and I saw everything was browsed on, I said, oh, 100% of the trees I found have been browsed on. I need to shoot more deer. Maybe, but more likely than not, I just need to open up the canopy a little bit, get some sunlight in here, and I need to encourage more early successional growth, get more woody browse on my property. So hopefully that makes sense. Those are just a few of the things that I'm scouting on my property as it relates to the food sources. Moving on to the next area of the property that I love scouting following the hunting season, and that's scouting the bedding areas on the property, scouting your sanctuaries. And there's gonna be two things I'm gonna talk about here that I like doing while I'm scouting. And the first is locating those new bedding areas, those bedding areas that you might have seen the deer kind of coming from in the afternoon, but maybe you didn't know that there was a bedding area over there, or maybe this is a new property and you're trying to figure it out for the first time. You might have an idea as to where these deer were bedded during the hunting season. Maybe you have some high ground or some elevation change on your property. You have some really thick areas that you kind of want to get into, or maybe there's a few peninsulas that kind of shoot out into wetland areas, or maybe some islands within that wetland. And getting into these areas and scouting them for the first time can really tell you a lot about what the deer prefer to bed in on your property. Most of the time you can differentiate between whether or not it was a doe family group using that bedding location or if it was a single buck using that location. Again, if it's multiple beds in a certain spot, most likely a doe family group. Multiple pellet sizes, large pellets for the larger does, smaller pellets for the fawns. If you're finding a single bed with larger tracks, larger droppings, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a buck, but you can make a stronger case that that could be an individual buck bed. Combine those first observations with maybe a lot of scrapes around the area, a lot of rubs within close proximity of that individual bed, and you can make a stronger case that that is an individual buck bed. And when you do scout your property and you find areas like this, there's a couple things that I really like to do. The first is always ask yourself why. Why are these deer bedded where they are? Why are those does bedded in this area? Why is the buck bedded over here? And the second thing that I like to do when I find these areas, and this can kind of piggyback off the first with the question of why are they here, is to really study the area, study the habitat, study the conditions that these deer are bedded in, so then you can take that and try to recreate it somewhere else on the property to try to influence deer bedding in other areas on the property. Also, if you're finding these natural bedding areas, the ones that you didn't create, as long as it fits within the overall flow of the property, within your plan, just make note of where they are and just continue to maintain those going forward. There's gonna be times where there's gonna be windstorms that go through and trees are gonna fall into there. And depending on the amount of damage that's done from the blowdowns, deer might not feel comfortable bedding in that area anymore. So you need to go in, and that needs to be a place that you check prior to the next hunting season or just throughout the off season to make sure that there's nothing that blocking escape routes, nothing blocking where these deer like to bed. Make sure that you maintain that area going forward as long as it works as a part of the overall plan. Another crucial aspect of scouting bedding areas following the hunting season is to scout your man-made bedding areas. You want to go in there to see if the deer are using your bedding areas. If they are, what areas are they using? What areas do they seem to like best? Are there certain areas that they're avoiding? If they are avoiding certain areas, try to figure out why. Did you have a tree fall down kind of blocking one of the escape routes? Is it too tight that these deer don't really have a whole lot of room to move around? Are they constantly jumping over a downed tree to get in and out of the bedding area where you could easily just section that tree out to allow them, an easier way in and out of the bedding area? Just try to make observations like this as you're scouting your man-made bedding area to see what you can improve on and try to reinforce what seems to be already working. when you do create bedding areas on your property through timber stand improvement, and you might supplement that with some hinge cutting, there's going to be some trial and error. You might not get it right the first time, and in fact, there's always going to be something that you can improve on. The deer will tell you what they like, and just try to figure out, what areas are they avoiding, what areas do they really seem to like and prefer to bed in, and build upon that. So hopefully that makes sense. Those are just a few things that I'm scouting as it relates to bedding areas during that first scout following the hunting season. The last thing that I want to touch on in this video for what I'm focusing on while scouting my property for the first time, and you can probably guess it, are the deer trails on my property. And just like with the food plots and with the bedding areas, I'm looking at a few things while I'm scouting these deer trails. The first, just like with scouting those man-made bedding areas, is are these deer using the trails that I'm trying to encourage the use of? Now, there are going to be a lot of deer trails moving throughout your property, but there are also going to be deer trails that you are going to really try to encourage the use of by the way you design them and the way that you construct them. And when you're scouting the property for the first time following the hunting season, you want to take a look at these trails and see, are they using them as I have intended them to? Are they moving from point A to point B down the trail that I'm trying to encourage? If they are using your trail, great. If not, again, you need to try to figure out why. And there could be a lot of different reasons as to why a deer isn't taking a particular trail. It could be too tight and they feel too claustrophobic, there's not enough ways out. It could also be that it's too wide open and they don't feel safe walking down this path, or maybe because it's so wide open, there's not really a path at all. Or it might just be that you don't really have a point A or a point B. Deer need a destination, they need a starting point, and they need a destination. So if you don't really have that, then there's not really a reason for them to be taking this trail. Again, there are a lot of reasons as to why a deer might not be taking an individual trail, but just try to figure out the why behind it so then you can correct that in the off season to hopefully increase your chances the following season. Another thing that I'm looking for while scouting deer trails on my property is how often are these deer getting downwind of my stand locations. It's going to happen every once in a while that a deer is going to walk behind you, but you do not want that to happen very often. And if you're seeing a major trail running behind one of your stand locations, it's time to make an adjustment, either in your stand location or it's time to block off that trail to force them in front of your stand location so they cannot get downwind. And some of these observations you'll be making during the hunting season, deer are getting downwind of me, time to make an adjustment. But another great time to see whether or not deer are getting downwind to your stand locations is after the hunting season when you're scouting and you're walking these deer trails. The last thing that I want to talk about as it relates to scouting deer trails, something that I really like to do following the hunting season, is to map my deer trails. I use OnX, the tracking feature. I think most of the hunting apps have a tracking feature. If you don't have the hunting apps, you can use any free running or workout software. A lot of that has mapping software in it. And really, you just want to start from one end of the trail, press track, and follow it until it ends or until you get to the property line. And then just kind of do that on multiple different trails as you go through your property. And what's really fun with this is then you can go back to the computer at home and kind of see how those trails are moving through your property. If you've had your property for a while and you know how the deer really like to use your property, this might not be as much of a benefit to you. But if this is a new property for you and you're trying to figure out how these deer are using your property, map as many of the trails as you can. And then when you bring that up on the computer, you can get a pretty good idea as to how these deer are moving around, and it might help you identify a few new stand locations. Find a couple major intersections, and if that happens to be more in the interior, maybe that's a cell camera location. If they're closer to the exterior of their property, that might be an area to evaluate for a future stand location. I do want to throw in one more bonus tip in here for scouting your property for the first time following the hunting season, and that's if you can, wait for snow. I want to get on my property and scout it as soon as the season ends, and I'm sure you guys are very similar, but if you see snow in the forecast, try your best to wait for the snow to fall, let it sit on the ground for a few days, and maybe scout your property about 3 days after that snowfall. This is beneficial because you're going to be able to see exactly where these deer are going, and it's going to be from within the last 3 days, so you're going to have very relevant sign. What's really cool about this, when you have snow on the ground, you can a lot of times take the tracks from individual deer within your food plots and you can track them back to individual beds on your property. So if you see a pretty big track in your food plot and you think that that might be a buck, or maybe you know it's a buck because you have a trail camera on your food plot and it's looking at the area where you've seen that track, you can track that buck all the way back to his bed or to the property line, whichever comes first. So that's just one extra bonus tip I wanted to throw in here at the end. If you can, wait for snow, because you can get a lot of great information and potentially from individual deer by tracking them after a fresh snowfall. But guys, that's going to wrap it up for today's video on scouting your property following the hunting season. I know we didn't cover everything, so if you have anything else you'd like to add or things that you really look for when scouting your property for the first time, I'd love to hear about it. Or if you have any questions on scouting or anything in general, please drop those in the comment section below. I'll get back to those as soon as I can, and we will see you guys in the next video.